Welcome, everybody. So this is a talk that involves video game consoles. Lots of us like playing games on our video game consoles, and I have two guys here, Michael and Felix, who like playing with their consoles a bit too much. And so much so they make them do things they were never intended to do. And we all like doing that in some walk of life. But let's hear the story of Xbox 360 and its security and what kind of things it can be made to do that it wasn't intended to from both of them. So welcome.
So hi, I'm Michael, and I'm going to do the presentation part, and later for Q&A, Felix is going to join me. So I'm going to do the talking, and he did the actual work behind all this. The Xbox 360 security system and its weaknesses. Whatever. Okay, the purpose of this talk. We've given several talks about console hacking, especially Xbox One hacking before. And it was all about bashing the security system, bashing the work that Microsoft has done with that one. But it's a lot different with the Xbox 360. The security system is really great. But the problem is that few people know how it works or how great it is. And the whole industry keeps making the old Xbox One mistakes over and over again, because there's just not enough documentation out there. There's no scientific paper or anything from Microsoft. So the idea of this talk is to educate people on secure hardware design, to see how Microsoft did it, and still the mistakes that they made, what could be done better in the future. Yeah?
What do you mean by great?
Well, first of all, let's do all the Q&A afterwards. And yeah, I'll come to the point why it's a great security system in the whole talk, I guess. So let me first talk about why it's necessary to have a security system. On a gaming console, it's pretty obvious. Copied games shouldn't be permitted. Unlicensed games, the industry has always had this problem. Cheating is pretty interesting for online games today. And also, if you can lock out modifying consoles to run Linux or alternative operating systems or homebrew programs that you don't want to have on your platform, that's also a nice thing. And what Microsoft has done and what pretty much everyone else is doing is just have one security system that controls what software may and what software may not run on your platform. So in order to talk about the Xbox 360 model, let's just spend a few minutes on revisiting the Xbox One model again and see what mistakes have been made there and what had to be made better for the second console that Microsoft made. The Xbox One had the problem of they had little time developing it. In just over 1 or 2 years, they had to start from zero and get a full gaming console. So what they took was a standard PC, basically, and their existing Windows, software Windows kernel, DirectX, and all these technologies. And they put the system on top of it, which is a chain of trust, which means anytime code hands execution to another piece of code, it will have to verify the authenticity of the next piece of code, and only in that case it can hand over execution. So in the case of the Xbox, system startup hands execution to the Windows kernel, which is in ROM, if it's okay, and the Windows kernel will launch a game only if it's also signed. So these are typically RSA checks or hashes. Let's look at the first step here, how the ROM can make sure that the Windows kernel is authentic and hasn't been tampered with. This is the mainboard of an Xbox One with a CPU, GPU, RAM, Southbridge flash. Normally, an x86 compatible CPU, as in the Xbox One, would boot from flash. But of course, then you could just replace your flash, and the first instruction, you would be in control of the first instruction that is executed. So what they did is they added some special code, secret code, 512 bytes of it, into the Southbridge chip, which on boot gets transferred over the bus, and which is the first code executed, which does some verification, decryption of the flash image, and then jumps to the flash image. The problem with this is it travels over a bus. Although the bus is pretty fast, there's always someone, in this case that's Bunny, who managed to build his own hardware to sniff that bus. So the secrets leaked and also the code leaked. So the first successful attempt that was made there is bus sniffing. And this is the code that was extracted. The purpose of the code is it does some basic machine initialization, which is done using a small virtual machine, which takes code, which takes its instructions from flash image, does the CPU setup, decrypts, and in theory also verifies, but in practice doesn't really, the flash image. And if it doesn't succeed, it panics. So if we want to use this, we have to look at the board, and what we see is this port here, which is an LPC port. We add a pin header and add a Modchip, which is nothing more than just a ROM chip, which works because when an Xbox is manufactured, they have to use this port for bootstrapping. The first time they boot it off this bus because the internal flash is not written yet, and then switch to the internal flash and write that. And that's still present on a retail box. And because the flash verification in that code that was extracted wasn't really working, this was made possible. So the second thing was manufacture time override, the second successful attack. So you can run anything like this bootloader that runs your favorite operating system. The chain of trust, the first part was hacked, but if you don't want to go the hardware way, but try to exploit something in software, the second check from Windows to the game looks pretty secure because you have a lot of code there. And I mean, by a lot of code, I mean you have enough space to fit a real RSA implementation from the Windows source code base, for example. So this looks pretty secure. But games load their own data. And this data can be save games. And there's always the possibility of buffer exploits there. And the nice thing is that all the games run in kernel mode on the Xbox One. So this is where this gentleman enters. 007 is one of many games that have string vulnerabilities in their save game loaders. And because as soon as we have a few bytes of code in the system, in kernel mode, we can chain load as many bytes as we want. This is this third successful attack, chain loading any code, which can be your own operating system. If you want to have everything a little more permanent, but not install your own hardware, you can boot into a Linux system and then rewrite your flash image with another bootloader. This doesn't work by default because the flash is write protected. Microsoft has not planned in-field upgrades of ROM chips. But if you just add 2 wires to the mainboard, this will be successful. So flash reprogramming is a fourth thing that happened, which shouldn't have happened. And one more thing that has happened is if you don't insert a game, it'll load the dashboard, which allows you to manage your save games, to play CDs, DVDs. And that also loads some data, which also is not checked. So by installing fonts on the hard disk, we can convert this into this. Note the subtle difference. And one more hack that has actually not been done because there have been so many other hacks, so this one wouldn't have made sense to do, is the DVD drive should be untrusted, but the DVD drive is the one that basically checks whether it's an original game or it isn't. So the CPU trusts it. It tells the drive tells the CPU it can just lie, and you can replace the firmware with your own firmware, which will just always lie. So this would be a fifth attack, the DVD attack. As I said, there are no in the field upgrades by Microsoft. I mean, yeah, upgrades, not downgrades. So. But still, if there are new revisions, new boxes manufactured, they will come with new system software, and you can use the old software to just downgrade the newer boxes, because there's no rev locking anywhere. So, sixth successful attack is downgrading. Let's look at all these attacks again. bus sniffing, flash reprogramming, manufacturer time override, chain load code, downgrade, DVD attack. And there's one more that has not been used on the Xbox One because there's no way the hardware would have supported it. There have been a lot weaker points in the system. It's code injection via DMA, which means if you look at the buses inside a computer system, the DVD drive, the hard disk, networking USB, and also the graphics chip, they all share the same bus, so they can all read and write arbitrary memory from a physical standpoint, without all the paging, without any protection. So if you manage to make your device write somewhere, you can change anything if you know the address where something is. But that seems to be pretty constant in many systems. So you can just modify your code to not check anything anymore. You can just attach a chip, waits for something, triggers on something, and injects something into RAM when it gets read. For example, there's this famous FireWire hack. You just attach something on a FireWire bus, and you can inject anything onto that machine because a FireWire cable is pretty much sits on the bus of your computer. So they had to do something against this too. So let's look at these attacks again, and let's think about some different ideas how to mitigate those attacks. The first thing, and the major weakness of the Xbox One, was that it didn't have enough ROM for startup, just these 512 bytes, which weren't nearly enough to do any secure authentication of whatever it ran afterwards. Also, it didn't have any internal RAM, so all the keys, everything it dealt with while decrypting, while verifying, was stored in insecure RAM. So what we need is a lot of ROM in the order of magnitude of 16, 32, 64 kilobytes for the decryption and verification code, and also a little bit of machine setup, and a big enough internal RAM so that we can store all the intermediate data. This way we can make boot up really secure, so that by keeping it minimal, we can be pretty sure that nobody finds an exploit. Then we can chain load something that is really trusted. So the first thing, bus sniffing, doesn't make any sense anymore if we put the ROM and the RAM directly inside the CPU. There's no bus to sniff anymore. There are no secrets going over any bus. Also, this way, flash reprogramming is pretty much impossible if we implement it right. And by having like 32 kilobytes of ROM and 64 kilobytes of RAM, we can make that possible. Then the next thing to do is decent privilege separation, which the Xbox One did not have. Everything ran in kernel mode. Now on the 360, everything will run in kernel mode too, except for the hypervisor. That will run in hypervisor mode. And the hypervisor has some extra privileges that kernel mode does not have. This is pretty much the same setup as kernel mode user mode, just shifted up by one level into hypervisor mode and kernel mode, which has speed advantages. Otherwise, it's basically the same. Hypervisor mode manages your MMU. It manages the page tables and the TLB. It can enforce write, X, or execute, which means that a page in memory is either writable or it's executable, but it cannot be both. So whenever a program or whenever an exploit wants to write its own code somewhere, it can write it, but it cannot make it executable. So a game has no means of making data executable. It will always have to go through the hypervisor, and the hypervisor can then decide by using signature. So this way, chain loading code is pretty much impossible. Something like return to lib can still be possible, but this is pretty much the best thing that can be done here. So chain loading code can be made impossible using this. But now if we were an attacker, we had the system that boots safely and has a hypervisor. How would we attack it? We would use something like a DMA attack to inject code into the hypervisor. We can just change some key in the hypervisor by attaching something to the USB bus or to any bus. So we have to make sure that DMA injection does not work. The way we can do this is memory hashing, which means that this is must be implemented in cache. So anytime a cache line is written back out to RAM, then a hash will be stored in the CPU's internal memory, and every time a cache line is read back, it will be compared to the hash, and if it's wrong, then the system will just lock up. So this pretty much guarantees that every time, this guarantees that all the memory that I ever read that is under this system has been written by the CPU and has not been written by any device. Because if a device writes it, then the hash will not match. Of course, we have to do DMA in the system, so we cannot make the whole system. Not all of RAM can be under the system. So this needs to be an opt-in feature, or opt-out for all those pages that require DMA. This is a nice system. It's very effective, but the problem is we need extra storage inside the CPU, and this can be very expensive. So a cache line on the PowerPC CPU, as it's used in the 360, is 128 bytes. And in order to have a secure hash of that, we need about 16 bytes. So for a 64 kilobyte internal RAM, internal to the CPU, which is pretty expensive, we can only secure about a megabyte of external RAM. The Xbox 360 has 512 megabytes of RAM, so there's no way we can secure everything using this. So in practice, we can protect the hypervisor, which is way below 1 megabyte of code. So code injection via DMA, we get 1 star for this. If we also want to protect everything that runs in unprivileged mode, which is the Xbox kernel and the actual game, if we want to protect that as well from DMA injection attacks, then memory encryption can help us. It's not as good, but it's a lot cheaper. It also works on the cache level. So every time memory is fetched, it is decrypted, and every time it's stored back, it's re-encrypted. The same applies here. This cannot work with pages that require DMA because of the very idea behind it. Whenever you have DMA, it shouldn't be able to write anything which is marked encrypted and therefore secured. But while DMAing into something protected by hashing will lock up the system, in this case, it will only destroy the data. Because if you DMA something, then it will be in plain text in memory, but when the CPU reads it, it will try to decrypt it, so it will get garbled data. So this can be used for some attacks. Like if there's a blacklist somewhere to blacklist some application, we can just destroy that blacklist and the compare will not match anymore. Also, some jumps on PowerPC, a jump on PowerPC is, if I remember correctly, just 6 bits. So 6 bits encode the jump, and the rest is the offset. So there's a pretty good chance that if we try this over and over again, we might hit the correct 6 bits for a jump and just jump somewhere, and then can fill the whole memory with knobs to catch our jump. So this is not perfect and not as effective as hashing, but it's cheap. There is a small performance penalty, but we don't need any extra RAM. So in practice, we can use this to protect the hypervisor and also all the game code. And what's nice about this is it obfuscates everything that is in RAM or everything that we want to protect in RAM. So all the code in RAM cannot just be sniffed by a DMA device. So we can make the whole system obscured so that no code will ever be visible anywhere. If we encrypt the games, if we encrypt the flash, so an attacker will have a hard time to find any code that he can look for security vulnerabilities in. So code injection via DMA, that gets us another half a star. A random number generator is another idea which can improve the effectiveness of the previous techniques. The problem with the encryption that I've described so far is that it would be predictable. So I can do replay attacks. If I dump my memory at one point and replay it at some other point, the encryption would still be the same all the time. And I could inject a different state, or I could inject a state of previously into some part of the system and keep the state in another part of the system to make things mismatch and to make them behave as I want them to. So by having a random number every time the system boots, there's no way to replay anything anymore, and all the data will just be gobbled again. This will give us another half a star for code injection. Now, eFuses is another interesting technology invented by IBM and implemented in some of their products. And the PowerPC chip on the Xbox 360 is also done by IBM. It's a way to, well, an eFuse, they are cheap. You can have lots of them. You can have hundreds of them inside a CPU. And you can blow them at runtime. So there's no way to undo this later. So one nice feature one nice way to use this would be to disable features that we only need at production time. For example, JTAG. All the things that we need for verification, for testing in the manufacturing process can be disabled later on by blowing a fuse. Also, we can make every CPU have its own unique per box key by also blowing a couple of fuses and burning the key into the CPU. And that key will be inside the CPU and will never leave the CPU if we don't choose to. This key can be used for crypto on the flash chip, so that the flash chip will be encrypted just for my box. I cannot swap any flash chips. And also indirectly, it's used for DVD pairing, for keeping a secret in flash, which is a key to pair with my DVD-ROM drive, so that I cannot use another DVD-ROM in my systems. I cannot swap those, or I cannot manufacture just a DVD drive or a device which emulates a DVD drive, but in reality is a hardware and just emulates those games on the hardware, because those are chained together. My DVD drive needs to have the exact same key as the Xbox. Also, whether it's a dev kit or it's not a dev kit will be stored in the fuses. Dev kits behave a little differently. They allow a lot more things. And update revocation. Whenever I update the system, I can blow a fuse. And even if someone downgrades the flash chip by desoldering it or by doing anything fancy, it will not accept this flash anymore, because the revision count in the flash is not the same as the number of blown fuses. So this will give us a few nice extra features. Manufacturer time override, we pretty much mitigated that. Downgrading can be made impossible if implemented properly. And DVD attacks are made a lot harder. You'd have to dump the key of the box in order to make a device that emulates a DVD drive. And also code injection via DMA is harder using this, because we have a per box key which can be used as a seed for the random number generator and other things. So everything we need, hypervisor, SRAM in the CPU, some additions to the caching, to the way addresses are generated, fuses and a random number generator. The nice thing, it can all be implemented inside the CPU. There's no dependency on any external device. This is an easy version of what a 3-core PowerPC system would look like, with the 3 processors, their own MMUs, each connected to their L1 cache and that connected to the L2 cache. And what can be done to add all this security without changing any of the actual architecture of these components is just adding stuff outside of it. So yeah, this is the standard core. And we can add a random number generator, eFuses, ROM, and SRAM to the system, external to the actual CPU. And by adding some logic, which does the hash calculation and does the crypto for loading and storing L2 cache, which is connected to SRAM because of the hashes that it stores, we can add the whole security external to the actual normal CPU. But what we have here is still one die, so nothing travels over any buses. Everything is inside the CPU. which has to be a custom part anyway. For the Xbox One, it was a standard off-the-shelf Celeron CPU, but you won't be able to find any 3-core PowerPCs out there, so this has to be a custom part anyway. But still, all the modifications are done outside of the critical regions, so it is a cheap and easy modification. If we look at the board, CPU, North Bridge, South Bridge Flash, RAM, everything is contained inside the CPU and nothing travels over any buses anymore. Now let's look at some details in practice. For secure boot, we have 32 kilobytes of internal ROM. And 32 kilobytes, if you compare that to the 512 bytes of the Xbox One, this is really a lot. You can fit whole RSA algorithm, SHA1 for verification in there to be really sure that the code there that you're running from Flash is okay. And also 64 kilobytes of internal RAM, which should be fine for your calculations. Hypervisor mode is something that is supported by 64-bit PowerPC processors anyway. The hypervisor code is about 128 kilobytes. And as I said before, it manages the page tables, enforces write, X, or execute. In practice, all the pages from the hypervisor itself are hashed, and all the code pages in the system, including all of hypervisor code and data, are encrypted too. And only the hypervisor can make code executable. The hypervisor is very lightweight. It pretty much only does memory management on a very low level. It does not interact with hardware at all. That's all the job of the kernel, which is running in untrusted kernel mode. But it has to catch all the interrupts and exceptions, and most of them it just passes up to kernel mode. Now about hashing and encryption, that has been done in a very interesting way on top of the existing PowerPC architecture. So a 64 PowerPC would support 64-bit physical addressing. But we don't need 64-bit addresses on an Xbox 360. We only have 512 megabytes of RAM and some more I/O ports. So everything should fit within 4 gigabytes, which is 32 bits. So there are addresses generated which have spare 32 bits on the top. And this is where some extra flags are transmitted. These flags mean something to the L2 cache. For the L2 cache, this, as we can see in this example, if we have this magic value of 100, means that this page has to be encrypted and hashed. So the CPU doesn't know anything about it. It's just a matter of setting up the page tables to point to addresses like these, with the upper 32 bits set to something besides 0. And the L2 cache will take care of hashing and encryption as we choose it. Yep, so hashing is implemented in L2 cache. For every 128 bytes, which is a cache line, we have 16 bytes SHA1, and the hashes are stored in 64 kilobytes internal CPU SRAM, which is the same SRAM which is used for boot up for the crypto routines that run at the very beginning of CPU startup. So this is enough for hashing 1 megabyte. Encryption, same thing, implemented by L2 cache, which looks at those extra bits, and the key has to be set up by the CPU and taken from the random number generator at startup. We have 768 bits, 768 eFuses that we can blow individually. The features of those are, for example, JTAG disable. So the CPU supports JTAG, but after all the testing is done, this is disabled. The unique key for flash decryption and for many other things. So many things are based on this key. Is also burned into eFuses, the devkit or retail identifier, and the update sequence counter. Now I've just described the whole security system in theory. Now, how do some things work? Let me explain some things in practice. Paging. So everything that runs in kernel mode, which is the Windows kernel, Windows 2000 derived kernel, and the actual game, they run in a paged environment. So there are page tables set up somewhere, which are controlled by the hypervisor. And the way encryption and hashing is managed is just by putting those bits into the page table. So in this example, the virtual address on the left will be mapped to the physical address on the right, which in the end is just the lower 32 bits in this case, but which also tell the L2 cache to, in this case, turn encryption and hashing on. So the hypervisor will just enforce that every time a page is executable, it will also have the bit for encryption turned on. This is nothing that the hardware enforces, but the hypervisor will enforce every time it lays down a page table entry. The hypervisor itself is not paged, although it's encrypted and hashed. So for some reason, it might be performance, it might be simplicity, it runs without paging, which is called real mode, but it can still be encrypted and hashed because of a feature called the Hypervisor Real Mode Offset Register, HRMOR. Every time you have an address which has the uppermost bit 63, or if you think PowerPC, then it's bit 0, which has this bit set, means that the offset of the HRMOR will be added. So every time, so the hypervisor thinks it runs at offset 0 in RAM, but this offset gets added, which effectively adds just the flags. And these flags mean that hypervisor will be encrypted and hashed. At manufacture time, so how does manufacturing work? All the eFuses, when the CPU is manufactured, is 0. So the ROM that is embedded in the CPU will know the special case and can behave differently. So it can boot a generic flash image and then download some special code for the first time, generate its unique key and store it in the eFuses. It can personalize the flash image and encrypt it with its own key, and also generate a DVD key, encrypt it with its own unique key, and store it in flash. Loading an executable is something that the Windows kernel cannot do by itself because it needs to be verified, and verification can only be done by the hypervisor. So while the Xbox kernel in untrusted mode loads the executable into memory, it will hand chunk by chunk to the hypervisor, which will then check the authenticity of the code. And if it's signed properly, or if it's hashed properly and the header will be signed, then it can make the code executable. And the way it can make the code executable is pretty interesting. If you have an address and the same address with the upper 32-bit set so that it's encrypted and hashed, and you just copy from that one address to the other address, you will implicitly encrypt it. So it just goes over the whole area and encrypts it by copying it to the same address plus encryption, and then lays down the page table entry to make it executable. Firmware updates look pretty straightforward. The way it's done is you don't replace the flash. For safety reasons, I guess, they just append patches to the flash, binary patches. And every time you add an extra patch, it will have a sequence count, or you can count the number of patches. And every time you add a patch, you also burn one fuse. So in case the last patch is missing, or one more fuse is burned, then you have patches, then the box can refuse to boot. But still, so this was the system, but there is at least one vulnerability that has been found, which is quite interesting because it's in one very prominent location, which is the Syscall handler of the hypervisor. On the left, you can see the disassembly. It first compares the argument with 61, so you see you have roughly 100 or so syscalls. If it's greater or equal, then it's illegal. Otherwise, it shifts it left by 2, so it indexes an array of pointers, loads that value from the jump table, and loads it into the link register and jumps there. On the right, you have the same thing in C. But can you see the problem? It's not about signed. It's more subtle. It's these two instructions. The compare works on words. The rotate works on longs. So it only compares the lower 32-bit, but then it takes the whole number and shifts it left. So if we give it something that is 4 billion, above 4 gig, and has something very tiny at the end, it will pass this test, but still be way above this. So we can feed in incorrect values. We can control bits 34 to 63 of the effective address. So the way this would work normally, we have syscall number of 2A. We shift it left by 2. We add that offset, which is 1044. And then, because the hypervisor runs in real mode, this offset gets added, which is because the uppermost, the MSB, is clear, which means that must be added. We have this effective address. With the exploit, we can do this. We feed in this address, or this syscall number. That's fine. That's lower than 63 if we only look at the lower 32 bits. But then we shift the whole thing left by 2. So we have the MSB set. Now we add the offset again. But now the base does not get added. So what we get is this address, which doesn't have the protection bits, which doesn't have the bits that we need to fetch this from encrypted and hashed memory. So if we have a way to store something at the syscall, in the syscall jump table at 2A, which is not encrypted, then the code will read it from this address unencrypted. So we just need to do DMA injection into this one value, and then make it somehow that it executes the syscall with these parameters. Now, how do we do that? Shaders. Games cannot just sign everything that they come with. And it's normally not necessary because you cannot change that anyway, because you cannot copy a game. But of course, you can copy a game if you hack the DVD drive. That's the first step. Then you can have your own copy of King Kong. Then all the graphics data is not signed. That's pretty much fine. The shader code, that's a problem. That should be signed because shader code is actual executable code which runs on your graphics hardware. And that can access all of memory. And if you write good shader code, you can just write anything anywhere. Of course, you will not do the encryption, and all those DMA attacks won't work. But you can write that syscall index unencrypted, which we later need unencrypted. But the question now is, how do we do this hypercall, the syscall into the hypervisor? The interesting thing, and I regard this a bug, is that the thread state, so the register states of the threads, are saved in an unencrypted data segment. So when task switching is done, this thread state, including all the registers, needs to be saved in RAM. Is it code? Is it a code segment, so that DMA attacks don't work, or is it a data segment? It's a data segment, so we can just overwrite those registers. So we overwrite those registers using the DMA attack, using a shader, to that next time the registers get loaded from that thread state, we'll have the registers for that syscall, and then we'll set the program counter to some syscall instruction, which is in our game or in the kernel. So what happened was this was reported to Microsoft. It was fixed by Microsoft in just 6 days. But still there are lots of vulnerable systems which can at least be upgraded to that version so that you can run anything on your box, which includes, for example, the Linux operating system. Now let's look at the mistakes. What has been made wrong here? The design looked pretty good. Also, what I like about the design is that it's pretty easy, pretty simple. I find it's pretty easy to understand, and it's all contained inside a very simple system, all very simple ideas. And also the implementation has been quite good, but still there have been mistakes. There's always 3 kinds of mistakes that you can make. strategy mistakes, design mistakes, and implementation mistakes. Strategy mistakes are the worst ones. Therefore, let's first start with implementation mistakes. So the hypervisor interface, obviously that was a mistake, but we haven't found any other bugs, although we, or actually lots of other people, have looked at a lot of code and not found any vulnerabilities there. The implementation was really good, which might have been caused also by the fact that the code has always been kept minimal. So it's not just link everything in it or look at every case, just keep it simple. Keep everything minimal so that you don't have all those mistakes. As it was shown with the Xbox One, in just 512 bytes, they managed to fit 3 or 4 security vulnerabilities. With the design, I think they have made a few mistakes with the design. First thing is the thread state, and also all the stacks are stored in data segments. Registers are something that should be regarded as code. They are just as valuable as code. So they should not be stored somewhere where DMA attacks are possible. They should have put this into encrypted data. In a way, it makes sense to store them in unencrypted data because encryption gives you a tiny performance penalty. And having your stack in an encrypted area, which gets read and written all the time, might not be a good idea performance-wise. But still, this attack wouldn't have been possible if those had been in an encrypted area. Also, the hypervisor runs without the MMU, and with this system, it was possible to use that hack with the uppermost bit. If the hypervisor had used page tables too, it would have been a lot harder. If you look at it from a design perspective, you might think that the hypervisor is the piece of software that is in control of the whole system. Why should I limit the powers of that single piece of software which has full powers anyway, or which requires full power? But it does make sense. That's the principle of least privilege. Even if that code must be absolutely trusted, not every part of the code needs to do everything. So if the hypervisor runs with an MMU, and cannot just access all of memory, cannot just access something unencrypted by just having a different pointer, but would have to set up a page table in order to do that, then it would have made this hack a lot harder, at least, if not impossible. And, well, DVD security also was pretty much absent. I guess the reason was that Microsoft was not in control of the DVD drive itself. They had several manufacturers make the DVD drive, and the DVD drive itself is not a secure system. So it couldn't really be trusted. So there was always this possibility of the DVD drive lying to the system. Now, the most severe mistakes that have been made over and over again by pretty much any company, which are the strategy mistakes. Point number 1, never use a single security system to lock out 2 independent groups of attackers. Or in other words, don't protect the interesting assets with the same key as the important assets. And by interesting, we mean interesting from a hacker's perspective and important as from the company's, from the manufacturer's perspective. Because this has happened a lot in the past. Let's look at devices since 1999. The PlayStation 2, released in 1999. I don't really know about how the security worked or how and when it was hacked, but it was hacked for piracy. And yeah, the effect was obviously piracy. But after that, there's this German set-top box, D-Box 2, in 2000. It had a signed kernel, pretty lame security from today's perspective, but it had something. It just didn't just run any code. It was hacked in a very small amount of time. It was hacked in order to run Linux, but it had the side effect of people decoding pay TV. GameCube, encrypted boot. It took quite a long time because people weren't so interested in that platform. They were interested in running, well, it came out at the same time as the Xbox. And the Xbox had a hard drive and was a PC. It would have run anything. And the GameCube was this limited small system. So it wasn't all that interesting. Just when the Xbox was finished, all the Xbox hackers went over to the GameCube. So why it was hacked was also, yeah, for homebrew, for the good cause. And the effect was piracy. Xbox. it was hacked for Linux, for homebrew, and yeah, these hacks have been abused for piracy, because anytime you can run your own code, you can just run any game that doesn't have all those checks that might be embedded in the game anymore. Do you see a pattern here? Nintendo DS, same thing for homebrew, used for piracy. PlayStation Portable, same thing. It happened to the 360. It happened to the Wii. What's pretty interesting is it was quite quick on the Wii. But wait, there's one that is different. There's the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 has a security which is comparable to the Xbox 360 security, but yet it has not been hacked, although the Xbox 360 has been hacked. And why is that? Well, they provide a means of running anything you want. They have this run other OS, and you can just run Linux, or you could port your favorite operating system to it. So the hacker community just hasn't been that interested in it. There's the piracy community, and there's the homebrew community. And the homebrew community are the really good people, as it shows. So yeah, if someone wants to design a good system, the first and most important thing is to keep out the hackers by just letting them do what they want to do. Okay, we're up for a Q&A now. And as I don't know anything, Felix is your man.
Hey, so, anybody? Wow. Well, must be a pretty good presentation then.
For everyone is confused.
Oh.
So there's all this encryption and decryption going on at runtime during the course of playing a game. Is there any measure of what are the cost semantics behind that? Does it detract from the power of the system to have this, to encrypt and decrypt every page of memory?
In terms of performance? Yeah, so I was told, I'm not completely sure if it's true, that there's a cost of latency, but not really of throughput. So the memory latency is like 500 clock cycles or something anyway. So it doesn't matter much if there are like 16 additional cycles. So that's basically the key, like hiding the latency from the encryption. Because the throughput isn't the problem, the latency is. And that's high enough anyway, so that it doesn't really matter. So I was told there is no real cost of this encryption. Because otherwise, I mean, performance costs money, especially in that console market. So they wouldn't have done it if it really costs performance. So apparently, no, there's no real cost of that encryption. Yeah.
Please step up to the microphone. Thanks.
With all this data and code hiding inside the CPU, could you tell what it took to actually find the hacks?
I knew this question would come up. So given enough time, I think every secret can be exposed. And it was the same on the system. We don't really want to disclose how we initially got the hypervisor code, but it was not leaked. And I think it's not a hack which can be repeated or something. But it was another hack, so you shouldn't rely on the fact that something is secret or secure in a system. You should think that at some point the hacker will know every secret of at least one specific device, and your security should still work if all those things are known. So your code should be secure even if people know it. I mean, that's nothing new, but I think the Xbox shows again that this is an important thing. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer your question, so it's a long story.
With all the increased security in terms of hardware checking, how does that affect the cost of fixing broken parts? So it seems that if we've got these eFuses linked into a DVD drive and the DVD drive stops working, how would that affect replacing that part?
So while the actual DVD key is not encoded in the eFuses. The eFuses encode a key which is then used to encrypt the so-called key vault, which contains basically all the interesting, the per console stuff, like the DVD key. So because Microsoft can sign any code they want, they could just do a binary which is signed and run that to basically dump the internal key to decrypt then the key vault or encrypt the new one. Actually, this is done a bit more intelligent. The CPU key never leaves the CPU. So even while production and even while upgrades and repair, at no point you need to know the actual key. Like there's an API to the hypervisor where you can, for example, set a new DVD key, provided you authenticate yourself with a challenge, which is even another API in the hypervisor. So it's all based on knowing the right keys. If you know the right private keys, you can authenticate to the hypervisor and basically do whatever you want. So that's what they do for repairs and production and development and everything else.
Why is that the shader code can read all of memory?
So your question is why a shader can read and write memory? So this is a unique feature of 360 GPU. It actually can do, it has a feature called memory export, which is basically the 360 is a DirectX 9 based platform. So it doesn't have those geometry shaders and stuff, but to have some new feature, they added this called memory export, which basically allows a vertex shader to write the generated data to the memory. So a later shader can pick up that memory and do a second pass over the geometry or something. So that was the intention to add this memory export feature, which is actually just writing an address to a special GPU register and then writing the data to a special GPU register. And that will actually put the data into memory. So it's used for multipass geometry and although pixel shaders if you really want. But we abused this feature for writing stuff we care about into memory.
So what's the current state of Homebrew, how safe it is, and maybe a little bit about the tools that are out there?
So the thing is that Microsoft quickly patched the problem. At first, they just patched the single instruction which was wrong, which is the shift instruction. They patched it to doing just a 32-bit shift, so the upper 32 bits are dropped, which fixed the issue. In later versions, they also improved the memory protection. So now the thread data is actually in encrypted memory. They added an API for this. And they did some other things. So unfortunately, it's not so easy to downgrade an up-to-date Xbox 360 back to the vulnerability version. So there has been another attack, which is called the downgrade attack or the timing attack, which is a bit complicated to explain. But basically, it allows you to, with some small hardware hack, to downgrade an existing Xbox to an older kernel, which has the problem again, so which can be exploited. Unfortunately, the really recent Xboxes, which have the reduced power, like the 65 nanometer CPU, don't run the old kernel anymore. This is not an intentional fix or something. This is just because they also have a different GPU revision where the old kernel doesn't know anything about. So old Xboxes, like old hardware, can be downgraded using a small hardware hack, which basically involves like some timing measurement and some flash override, so you can do a timing attack on some specific data. The newer Xboxes cannot be downgraded, so there's currently no way to do Homebrew on this. The disadvantage of all those methods are if you downgrade your kernel, you cannot run any recent games anymore. So you're forced to not buy any games anymore if you want to do Homebrew. So you need a separate machine for Homebrew, and yeah, that's the disadvantage of the hack. You have to run the hack every time you boot your machine, because there's no way to... We haven't yet found a bug in the bootloader or in the ROM of the CPU or something which can be used to automatically start the kernel every time you boot. So all the time you have to launch that game with a hacked shader and run our code.
So the Xbox 360 had a bunch of hardware glitches, right? it's just not as stable as the original Xbox was. Do you have any clues on why that is so, or if it's because of the security they've put in?
I don't think it's security related. I think they had some manufacturing trouble. I don't know exactly. There was a lot of media coverage about those issues, and I think nobody except Microsoft have exact numbers on this. So I have like 10 Xboxes at home, and not a single one of them failed. So the numbers telling you that 30% or more of those are failing, they are just not true, at least for me. I'm not sure about a greater number of Xboxes, but it is a problem. I'm not sure how large the problem really is, but I don't think it's related to security. It seems to be related to some thermal stressing of the GPU, actually. I'm not a hardware designer, so I don't know exactly. And it took Microsoft a long time to get a real fix for this, so it seems to be a harder problem than it would seem at the first sight. So. Okay, thank you for listening.